Well, if you've ever studied communication at all, like in any as a topic, whether in a class in school or something, you may be familiar with what's called the 7% rule. It's sort of shocking, but only 7% of communication is actually the words that you say. The rest is what's called nonverbal communication, 93%. And you can see how it breaks down here. 38% is your tone of voice, pauses, things like that. And then there's the biggest piece of communication, which is body language. We can tell a lot from someone's body language. We can tell if they're nervous. We can tell if they're worried. We can tell if someone's confident. All of that we sort of pick up through these signals in their body language. We don't even really think about it, but we're picking up all these messages through body language. It seems kind of crazy, those that our words really matter that little. But if you just try to be observant for the next day or two, and you'll see, wow, that's really true. I'm picking up a lot more of the meaning of what someone's saying on these other things besides just the verbal. I'll give you an example. We have sort of a running joke in our house that the word fine, F-I-N-E, it never means fine. If I come home from work and I ask my wife, hey, how was your day? And if she takes a big exhale and maybe she gives me a hug and says, it was fine. Really that means it was really exhausting, but it was okay. That's what that means. If later on she knows I had a big meeting that day and she says, hey, how'd that meeting go? And I was like, it was fine. And I do something like that. Well, that means I don't really want to talk about it and it didn't really go that well. Yesterday I asked Madison if she'd go clean her room because I was running the vacuum, and she said, fine. Which I didn't even know a 6-year-old knew how to roll her eyes yet. But apparently I'm already in that phase of parenting. But that means I want you to know I don't want to do this, but yeah, I'll do it. Fine can mean all sorts of things as a word, but you'll contribute tone of voice, you contribute body language to it. It means a lot more. That's how all communication is, with all words. And before I actually tell you why we're talking about body language, just a couple side notes about body language. Think about how we often communicate to each other. Through text message, right? Well, which piece does text message fit in? It's only verbal, right? So have you ever had that situation where you try to tell a joke or something in a text and it just does not communicate? You try to be sarcastic or something? A lot is missed. Texting is great for logistics or exchanging information. It's not a great way to communicate. I think that's why emojis were created. To at least try to put a little bit of body language to whatever you're trying to say. Body language plays a huge part. One other side note. Think about our communication with God. Like what we just did in worship and prayer. Here's a question. Do you think body language matters in your communication with God? If body language matters that much in our communication with each other, does it play a part in our communication with Him? It's interesting. Can you really stand with your hands in your pockets or your arms crossed and say, you're perfect in all your ways? Does that communicate to God that way? Just interesting sort of food for thought. But we're talking about body language because the passage we're going to look at this morning has a lot of body language. In fact, way more is communicated through the body language in this passage than through the words. We're in a series this summer we're calling FaceTime. And really we're just looking at different interactions that Jesus has in the Gospels. These little snapshots, these encounters that Jesus has with one other person, and we're sort of dropping in on their conversation and sort of asking what we can learn from that. And so this morning I want us to look at a very short conversation that Jesus has with a stranger. It's his first time meeting this person. And the whole conversation, they only say 44 words to each other. It's not very long. In fact, the heart of the conversation, which we're going to look at, is only 14 words long, that of the spoken word. But as we said, the body language is way more. So if you turn with me to Mark chapter 1, we're going to be at the end of Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. And before we go any further, let's just read this passage. And again, I'll draw your attention to the different body language things that come out here. Mark 1, verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was filled with compassion. He reached out his hand and he touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately, the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. See to it that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. So here's what I want us to do as we look at this interchange, as we look at this encounter. I want us to sort of slow down and look at all the details in this story. And then I want us to sort of reflect inwardly and then reflect outwardly. So that's sort of our outline. We're going to look at the story and then sort of look inwardly and outwardly. So let's get into this story. This, just to give a little bit of context, this is at the very beginning of Mark. So we're pretty early on in Jesus' ministry. If you look at a few of the paragraphs right before this passage, you'll see Jesus is going around Galilee and he's teaching. He's teaching with an authority that people have not seen before. And he's accompanying this teaching with this miraculous power. So as you can imagine, it would still happen today if this happened. News is spreading very quickly about Jesus. And this news about Jesus has reached our stranger that we meet in this passage, verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him. Now let's just stop there for a second. We're told this man has leprosy. So let's just talk about leprosy for a second. Leprosy is a very painful disease, but it's painful in a different way than you might think. Leprosy, what it does is it attacks the nerve endings. It actually attacks them until they're dead and they don't feel anything. So leprosy is painful, but you don't feel any physical pain if you're a leper. And in fact, when you get to that point in your leprosy where you no longer feel any pain, you're in a lot of danger of abusing and damaging your own body. If you think about it, pain is a warning system to us. It's what tells us to stop doing something. So if you don't have those warning systems anymore, you end up hurting yourself without realizing. For instance, you may walk around on a screw all day and have no idea. You may pick up a hammer that's splintered and you may use it to do a project, destroying your hand and not even realize. You may scratch sort of a spot on your eyeball that's infected and have no idea, leaving you blind. So it's not uncommon for someone with leprosy to be missing body parts, fingers and toes, arms and legs. You may have heard the song about leprosy that someone wrote. It goes, leprosy, all my skin is falling off of me. Soon I'll be a triple amputee. It's all because of leprosy. Suddenly, I'm just half the man I used to be. There are pieces coming off of me as leprosy came suddenly. Why'd my arm fall off? I don't know, no one will say. I know something's wrong, because my leg just walked away without me. Hey, the song just keeps going on and on. And we can make sort of light of it. We can have some fun with it, but you can imagine the pain that was involved with this. But it's not a physical pain. The pain that someone with leprosy feels is an external pain. It's the pain of rejection. If you had leprosy in Jesus' day, you had to leave town. You had to move outside of the city. You had to live in sort of this leper colony. From day one, as soon as you had it, you said goodbye to all of your friends and family and you moved away. You could not come in contact with anyone else. You had to, by law, stay 6 feet away from all people. You had to dress differently. You wore clothes of someone who was mourning, who was going to a funeral. You had to wear those clothes. If you were in a crowd, you had to shout, unclean, unclean, so that everyone would know to stay away from you. Imagine the toll that would take, the rejection, the loneliness, the physical isolation. Immense suffering. So how long did this guy have leprosy? We don't know. But it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, we can imagine the level of dis-ease that he's been living with. So this man, he comes to Jesus, which that alone is totally taboo. Remember, you don't come up to anybody. You keep your distance. You stay away. But no, he runs up to Jesus. He's unclean. And look at his body language, what he does. We'll get to the words in a minute. But it says, this man with leprosy came to him begging on his knees. So he's on his knees. If you look at Luke's account of this same story, Luke adds one more detail. Not only that he's on his knees, but Luke says with his face to the ground. Okay, so get the picture. This man is like this before Jesus. Now, what does that body language communicate? What do you think? Submission. What else? Humility. Inferiority. Surrender, maybe embarrassment. Maybe he's ashamed. Like, don't even look at me. Probably worry. Afraid. And then it adds he's begging. That has to do with that tone of voice thing. Why does someone beg? Think about your kids. Why do your kids beg for something? They probably beg for one or two reasons. Either they think there's no chance they're going to get what they're asking for, so they slip into begging mode. Or they beg because they really, really, really want something. My guess is this guy's begging probably for both reasons. He probably thinks Jesus wants nothing to do with him, just like everybody else in that culture wanted nothing to do with people with leprosy. But he's also really, really, really wants to be clean. And so he's on his hands and knees, his face is to the ground, and he's begging to be free of this disease. That's the nonverbal stuff. That's the body language going on here, his tone. Now let's look at what he says. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. It's interesting. This is not a question. This is not even like an explicit request. No, this is just a statement. It's a statement that acknowledges Jesus' power. He has no doubt at all that Jesus could heal him. What does he doubt? He doubts that Jesus might want to heal him. And why does he doubt that? Because nobody wanted to do anything for lepers. He doubts Jesus is going to want anything to do with him. And so that's why he's on his hands and knees. That's why he's hiding his face. That's why he's begging. And that's why he very weakly makes this request. Jesus, if you want to, I know you could heal me. So that's the leper. Verse 40, the camera angles are sort of all on him. Verse 41, the camera shifts a little bit, and now we look at Jesus. Verse 41, Jesus was filled with compassion. Now stop there for a second. I put sort of asterisks around this because there's actually some discrepancy in this verse. Any of you looking at a translation that says something different right there? What do you have there?
Indignant.
Okay, so Jesus was indignant. That's pretty different, right? I mean, those two things, sometimes we'll come to a verse that, there's a word behind it and two different translations use two different things. But they may say like, Jesus was filled with compassion and Jesus had pity or something that sounds very similar. Two translations where one says Jesus was filled with compassion and the other says Jesus was indignant. I hope you're like, well, what's going on? How can these both be here? And so I want to just pull over for a second. We're going to come back to our story. But I want to just talk about this because this sort of thing comes up time to time when you're reading your Bible. And probably there's a footnote, right? If you have that version that says Jesus was indignant, what does the footnote say? Okay, so it says, does it say many manuscripts or something like that? Many manuscripts say filled with compassion. So what's going on here is this is what's called a textual variant. And I want to just talk a little bit about this for a second so that we kind of understand this. Chances are this may bring up more questions than answers. So if you want to talk more, I'd love to talk afterwards or we could set up a time. But this is important for us to talk about. It actually gets to a little bit of how we came to have the Bible today. How you came to have the Bible in your hands. And let's just talk about the New Testament because that's what we're dealing with. Okay, so Mark wrote down his gospel in a book sort of letter form. And then it got passed around to the churches, right? And each time his book got passed around, each church would make a copy of it. Like they would write it down. They didn't have photocopy machines. So how did they make a copy? It was probably one of two ways. Either somebody would stand up and read his book. They'd read Mark, and you'd be sitting there and you'd be writing it down. Or somebody would just be by themselves, they'd have marks here, and then they have a blank piece of paper here, and they'd be writing it down. Either way, you can imagine the sort of discrepancies that would come, inevitably come. If I was reading something and you were writing down, there'd be spelling errors. You might miss a word here and there. You can imagine if you're writing it like this to this, you might duplicate a word, maybe even a whole line if you weren't careful. Anytime someone copies something, there's just a certain level of human error involved in that. So now, to complicate things a little further, we don't have Mark's original copy. It probably wore itself out being passed around so much, and it's gone. We don't even have the copies of Mark's original. We probably don't even have the copies of the copies of the copies. What we have are copies that are about 100 years later. And if a lot of atheists and people who are really skeptical about the Bible, they'll look at that and say, see, you can have absolutely no confidence that what you hold in your lap is really what Mark wrote down. But that's really not true. It's really not. First of all, once you get to about 100 years, 200 years after, we have lots of copies. Lots of copies from all over different parts of the world. In fact, we have way more copies of the New Testament than any other ancient document. I could give you some stats. 5,800 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, 9,300 of other languages such as Egyptian and Coptic. Now, these aren't the originals, but these are all different copies. And there's a science. It's called textual criticism. And what that science does, it takes all these different copies, and it can sort of analyze them and get back to what the original was. Now, you may say, oh, it sounds a little bit fishy, but let me give you a different example. If I wrote down a letter, and then I had each of you copy it, so there'd be 125 copies then, and then I destroyed mine. It's gone. I burned it in the fire or something. All of yours would be different from each other. They would. There'd be slight differences. There'd be spelling errors. There'd be all things like that. But you could take all 125 of them, and you could analyze them, and you could get back to what I originally wrote. That is what this science of text criticism does. Now, let's get back to our situation. Oh, let me say one other thing before you really lose all trust in the Bible. So 99% of these textual variants that exist among these copies are things like spelling errors and duplicate words and things like that. Like 99% of them. And even the 1%, like the one we're dealing with in our verse, even that 1% doesn't affect any of the major doctrines of our faith. But let's talk about what's going on in our passage. So many of the manuscripts have this word, I sort of have it transliterated here, splagnesis, something like that, which means moved with compassion. Most of the manuscripts have that word. There's 4 manuscripts that are actually pretty old and pretty good manuscripts that have a different word. It's this word, orgistis. You can see they kind of even sound a little bit alike. And this means moved with anger. So, how do we figure out which of these is the original? So first you look at sort of the external evidence. Things like which one has more support. And the first one, moved with compassion, has way more, thousands of manuscripts have that, where, as I said, only 4 have that other one. But the next thing you do is you look at sort of internal evidence. And again, this may be way more information than you want, but I just thought this is a great example of something that occurs often when you're studying the Bible. The internal evidence, you're asking, well, which one would explain the rise to the other one? Like, which one would explain how the other one came about? And this is where, especially the editors of the NIV, they think that the moved with anger is probably the original. Because if you were writing this down, you might be tempted to soften such a strong reaction. You might be tempted to say, if you were going to change it, to soften Jesus' anger, to soften it to be compassion, rather than go the other way around. The problem with that sort of argument is that 2 other times in Mark, it says Jesus was moved with anger. And there's no copies anywhere where anyone tried to soften those. So if you're going to soften one, you think you'd soften like Jesus' anger completely out of the gospel, totally. And that just doesn't happen. Plus, there's some other explanations for why this might have come in there. In the next verse, Jesus strictly warns this guy not to tell anybody, and he goes and tells him anyway. And even before, as we talked about, he doesn't even request, he sort of expresses doubt that Jesus will even want to help him. So it probably what most likely happened, in my opinion, is in light of the fact that there's doubt in this leper and that Jesus sort of warns him afterward, probably what happened is there were some audible copies being made and someone missed the whole word and they filled in the gap with the word that sounded similar, what they thought maybe was being said. But I think we're on pretty solid ground to say that the real original here is that Jesus was moved with compassion, which is why all the other translations of the Bible all have moved with compassion. The King James Version, the ESV, NASB, it's only the NIV that goes the alternate route. So let's come back to our story. That was all just sort of, that was for free. So let's now talk about this passage with this Jesus being moved with compassion, because I think that's what's really happening here. So it says Jesus was filled with compassion. Well, what does that mean to be filled with compassion? He's seeing this guy with compassion in his eyes. Compassion is when you feel sympathy for someone. It's when you can, even for just a second, put yourself in their place and imagine how they're feeling. That's what compassion is. And then you respond accordingly. Seeing with compassion completely changes how you look at a situation. And let me just give you an example. Imagine you're on an airplane, okay? And let's just say it's Southwest, where you get to sort of pick your seats. So you're sitting on the airplane, you're all the way against the window, and all of a sudden, you see a dad with 4 little kids coming walking on the plane. And whether you're a praying person or not, you start praying, because you're like, please don't sit next to me, please don't sit next to me. And then all of a sudden, he jumps in the row right in front of you, and he and 2 kids, and then he puts the 2 extra kids right next to you. And you're like, oh brother, this is going to be a long flight. And it's way worse than you even thought. Like, these kids are just out of control. I mean, they're pushing each other, they're kicking the seat, they're playing with every button they can, they're sort of loud. And to make matters even worse, you look at the dad and he's just completely unengaged. I mean, he's just sort of looking out the window, and you just start having all these thoughts in your head, right? Like, man, if I was this kid's parents, I'd be whipping them into line, and what's up with this guy? He's not even paying attention to his own kids. And then halfway through the flight, they start pushing each other, and every time they push each other, they start to bump into you, so you decide, all right, I'm going to do something. And so you stand up and you say, hey, buddy, can you get control of your kids here? And then he looks at you and responds, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. Hey, guys, can you settle down? I'm sorry. My wife unexpectedly passed away last week, and we're just returning from her funeral. She wanted to be buried in her hometown, and I'm not here at all. I'm so sorry. And that completely changes how you feel, right? In an instant. You no longer are annoyed at these kids. You're no longer annoyed at this inattentive dad. No, now you've had a glimpse of compassion. Just like that, and it totally changes how you look at the situation, right? Jesus looks at this guy, and he feels compassion. I mean, he sees him lying prostrate on the ground. He sees all the sores on his body. He knows what leprosy does, but he sees way deeper than that. Jesus can see the rejection and the isolation and the loneliness that this guy's dealt with, being an outcast. He sees with compassion. And then what he does next would have shocked everyone. I mean, everyone. Jesus was filled with compassion. He reached out his hand and he touched the man. I mean, this would have probably even shocked Jesus. My guess is Jesus has experienced this, and all of a sudden he gets that inner, that spirit, that inner small voice that says, hey, go ahead and touch him. And Jesus was probably like, are you kidding? Probably like we would as well. This is not the person you would want to touch. They would kind of look a little bit gross. Certainly this would have shocked everyone around watching, because to touch someone who's unclean made you unclean. It was a huge cultural taboo. But probably the person who was shocked most of all was the leper himself. I mean, how many years had it been since anyone ever touched him? He was not expecting that at all. I mean, he wasn't even sure Jesus would listen to him, let alone heal him. And certainly, he didn't expect Jesus to touch him. Dr. Paul Brand, he's a leprosy specialist, actually. And he was treating a young person with leprosy in India. And he was working through a translator. And as he was sort of laying out the treatment plan ahead, he sort of put his arm on this leprosy patient as he was explaining sort of what was coming. And all of a sudden, the patient sort of burst into muffled sobs. And the doctor all of a sudden was like, well, what did I do? And so he asked the translator, and the translator starts quizzing the patient. And the translator eventually said, no, doctor, he's crying because you put your hand on his shoulder. Until he came, no one has touched him in many years. I mean, human touch is incredibly significant. Most times we start a conversation with someone else, there's some form of touching. We shake hands, we give each other a hug. It's part of every human relationship. I mean, there's tons of studies out there of how important touch is, especially for the development of children. So the emotional and the psychological toll it would have taken to have absolutely zero physical touch, it's immense. So Jesus, he sees his need to be healed, but he sees way deeper than that. He sees the deeper wound that needed to be addressed. And so what is Jesus' body language communicating? What does that simple act of a touch communicate to this guy? What do you think?
That he matters.
Yeah, he matters.
I'll accept him.
Yeah, acceptance. Love. Willingness, desire for relationship. All of that is communicated in a simple touch. I am willing. It's almost like when Jesus finally says the words, they're redundant. He's already said them in his touch. But he says, I am willing, be clean. That's our story. You know, the last couple verses of this passage really sort of go a different direction, so I'm not even going to address them right now. But I want us to reflect on this interchange a little bit. And I want us to first sort of reflect inwardly. And if you would, I want us to do a little bit of an exercise together, which will require you to close your eyes. Don't fall asleep. But close your eyes. You don't have to if you don't want, but this will help with this sort of thing. I want us to put ourselves in the place of the leper. It's not actually that big of a stretch. I'm not saying think of yourself having leprosy, but we are the ones with a need coming to Jesus. And maybe you don't have a need that needs, like something that needs to be healed today, but there is a circumstance in your life that you would love for Jesus to address. Maybe it's physical, maybe it's financial, maybe it's some sort of relational need, something with your job, but there's something you want to ask Jesus for. Imagine yourself before Jesus on your knees, your face to the ground. What would you be asking him for right now? Just take a second to think about that. Now keep your eyes closed for one more second. I mean, just as Jesus did with the leper, Jesus is looking at you with compassion. I mean, he sees deep into your heart. He's hearing what you're asking for, but he's looking way past even that to what you really need. So if you can, I want you just to picture Jesus bending low, wrapping his arms around you. For this leper, Jesus was addressing the deeper need of loneliness. What's the deeper need that Jesus wants to address in your life, in my life? Maybe it's a fear. Maybe it's insecurity. Maybe it's hopelessness. You can open your eyes. Jesus wants to engage us at that level all the time. And I think this story just sort of was a great reminder for me this week that Jesus, he wants to hear what we're asking, but he wants to go deeper in each of our lives, just as he did with this man. But the other thing as I was reflecting on this passage is that, okay, that's putting ourselves in the place of the leper, but Jesus asks us as his followers to sort of follow in his pattern. You know, after Jesus rose from the dead, he ascended and went back to heaven, and he sent his Spirit to live inside of us, and now we are Jesus' body here on earth, called to sort of live in the same pattern the way he lived. And so now we are the ones who get to look at others with compassion in our eyes, just as Jesus did. And especially to those living with this sort of dis-ease, the sick, the poor, the outcast. I mean, Jesus spent so much of his time with them. And from the beginning of the church, that's what the church has been doing as well. Addressing both the surface level need, but then going way deeper than that, to the soul level needs. Mother Teresa, along with her sisters in Calcutta, they actually set up a hospice clinic and a medical clinic for leprosy patients. And I wanted you to see what she says, or said. She said, "We have drugs for people with diseases like leprosy. But these drugs do not treat the main problem, the disease of being unwanted. That's what my sisters hope to provide. The sick and the poor suffer even more from rejection than from material want." An alcoholic in Australia told me that when he is walking along the streets, he hears footsteps of everyone coming toward him or passing by him becoming faster. Loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the most terrible poverty. And this is the ministry that Jesus jumped all over. And yeah, he healed people. He had that miraculous ability. But in each case, he went beyond that, to healing not only their disease, but their dis-ease. That's the pattern he left for us. To be these little Christs walking around with eyes of compassion, seeing those around us, seeing the deeper needs of rejection and loneliness, where we can step into that situation with love and with friendship and with relationship. And so that's how I've been praying for us this week around this passage. Praying, one, that we would interact with Jesus at this level. That we'd come to him with our need with this same sort of posture, and that we'd allow him to touch us at the deeper levels. But that we'd be a church that looks at other people with compassion in our eyes and is willing to meet that deeper need of those around us. So let me pray that for us now, and we'll close with a song.